This week is the first week of the year, which doesn't make any sense because we know that the year began on Rosh Hashanah. But then we're told that the year actually begins when we start reading Parshas Bereshis, the first Parsha of the Torah. And there's a famous Chassidic saying that the way a person establishes himself, sets himself up on Shabbos Bereshis, the Shabbos when we read the first Parsha of Bereshis, that's how the rest of the year will follow. That indicates that Parshas Bereshis is the real beginning. But the Rebbe points out that Shabbos Bereshis never really has a full week behind it. This year, Shabbos Bereshis was preceded by Parshas Bracha, the last Parsha of the Torah, on Simchas Torah, and the very next day we start Bereshis. So Bereshis doesn't really have the full impact of a Torah portion. It just has the potential. When do we have the actual real revealed power of the Torah and the beginning of the Torah? In a certain sense, that is this Parsha of Noach. Noach is an enigmatic person. The Torah itself gives us two sides of Noach. On one hand, the Torah says Noach is Ish Tzaddik. He is a righteous man. Not just righteous, Tamim. He was perfect, wholesome. It's a term that is not used to describe any other tzaddik. Abraham is not called Tamim initially. Moses is not called Tamim. Noach, as soon as we read about Noach, we're told that he was just a perfect person. And yet, we know that Noach is blamed for the teva, for the flood. Noach didn't pray for the people, the Zohar says. And if he had prayed and intervened, the whole flood could have been averted. So the prophet associates the flood, and the destructive power of that flood to Noach. The waters are called Mei Noach, the waters of Noach. He is given the blame. We also know, as we read later on in the Parsha, that after the flood is over, Noach plants a vineyard, and he drinks the wine, and he becomes intoxicated, and he is humiliated. And it was a terrible thing that happened, and because of that, he cursed his son and his grandson, Ham and Canaan. This is not exactly nachas from your children. Noach was a complex individual, as modern people would describe him. So the Torah itself relates to this dichotomy, this duality of Noach's being. When it says that he was Tamim, he was tzaddik, he was righteous, Tamim, he was whole or perfect, then it adds the words, in his generations. What does that mean, in his generations? Obviously, if you're righteous in your generation. You're not righteous in someone else's generation. You're not around. So Rashi, quoting the Talmud, says that there are two opinions what this means. But if we think about it, Rashi is not just giving us two opinions. Rashi is telling us that there are two sides to Noach. What are the two sides? So Rashi says, some interpret Noach's righteousness in his generations in a favorable way, as a compliment. That even in his generation, where there was such rampant evil, and in spite of that, he was righteous, that means that had he lived in another generation where people were not so corrupt and evil, he would have even been a greater tzaddik. He would have been much more holy. So that's interpreting Noach's righteousness in his generations in a positive way, that in his generation, in spite of the evil, he was still so righteous. But then Rashi says there are those rabbis, those sages, who interpret those words in a negative way. what do they say? They say that in his generation, relative to his generation, he was righteous. Had he lived in the generation of Abraham, and people would want to compare him to Abraham, he would have not been regarded as anything of note. This is quoting our sages in the Midrash. So what we see from here is that Noach was righteous and perfect, but it was relative to his generation. Relative to his generation, he was righteous. But relative to Abraham, he was not righteous. So it sheds a little bit of light on Noach, because Noach lived in a different time period as compared to Abraham. When Abraham came onto the scene, the Midrash says, Heschel ha'ir, the light started to shine. He brought light into the world. Abraham was a preparation for the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai. Before God was going to reveal himself at Mount Sinai and give the Torah to the Jewish people, the master plan for the world, God wanted to have a preparation for that. And Abraham was the beginning of that preparation, of that introductory phase. So Abraham lived in a time where you were able to have a much more illuminating spiritual existence, to show the way, to shine light and pave the way to make this connection to God. Noach didn't live in such a time. He lived in a time when the world was shrouded in darkness. And therefore, Noach was righteous relative to his generation. But had he lived in the time of Abraham, when the light was shining brightly, it's like lighting a candle in broad daylight. The candle does a lot of good in the darkness, and it's a formidable power. A little light can dispel a lot of darkness, but when you light a candle in daylight, it doesn't do very much for you. But in his generation, he was great. And even the negative is really positive. When we say that they interpret this way in a derogatory way, that if he would have been in the generation of Abraham, he would have been nothing, that doesn't mean that it diminishes his greatness. It just means that he was a candle. Abraham was the sunlight. And when you're dealing with a candle, obviously the candle is inferior to the sunlight. But nevertheless, Noach was able to bring that little bit of light in a time of darkness. The question is asked on the simple understanding of Rashi, and which is taken from the Midrash, that some people interpret his status as of righteousness in a relative way, that it's not a real great praise for him, and some interpret it in a positive way, that he would have been even greater had he lived in another generation. So the question is asked, why would the Torah want to diminish his greatness? The Torah avoids, the Talmud tells us, the Torah avoids using negative language for an animal, for a non-kosher animal. In this week's Torah portion, when the Torah describes the different animals that he took above the ark, when it refers to a non-kosher animal, it could have just said tameh, that's impure. But it uses a roundabout expression, asher einena tahora, that is not ritually pure. Why did the Torah use that kind of language, which adds letters to the Torah? And the Torah is so economical when it comes to words and letters. Why would the Torah choose to describe an animal, a non-kosher animal, in a roundabout way, a circuitous way? So the answer is that the Torah wants to tell us that we should always try to avoid using negative language. Negative language is a very destructive thing, and this is especially relevant in today's climate with the elections, where everyone is using the worst language to describe their adversary. And sometimes the language is violent, sometimes it's unclean, lacking purity, and it's very important to emphasize the Judaism's approach to language. The language has to be pure. So the Torah goes out of its way, the Talmud tells us, to describe a non-kosher animal in the least negative way possible. How much more so that the Torah would avoid trying to use disparaging language about a person, and not just a person, but a great person, a tzaddik, a perfect tzaddik, and yet here the Torah is hinting that, yes, only in his generation was he considered to be righteous. Had he been in the generation of Abraham, he would be a nobody. Why would the Torah use language that is disparaging for a tzaddik? So the Rebbe explained, based on the teaching of a Baal Shem Tov, when God tells Noach, Bo el hateva, go into the ark, there's also a deeper meaning, and it's a deeper meaning that is relevant to each and every one of us. When we read the Torah, people think we're reading about ancient history. Yeah, 4,000 plus years ago, there was a man called Noach, the people were evil, and God says, build an ark. But what relevance does it have to us? We're not Noach. God already promised there won't be another flood. What kind of ark do we have to build? Do you ever see anyone building arks? It's not a mitzvah to build an ark. So the Baal Shem Tov explained that the Hebrew word for ark is teva. Teva actually means word. Now some of you who are familiar with Hebrew will say, isn't the word milah word? Yes, that's also true. So there are two words for the word word. It's a nice word salad. So the word milah is word, and the word teva is also word. Now the reason why the word teva means word, because teva is a box, an ark. What is a word? A word is a container. It contains an idea. So when the Torah tells us to go into the ark, he said that to Noach, but he's saying that to each and every one of us. He's saying, go into the Word. Seek refuge from the world around you by entering the Word. What words are we talking about? So the Baal Shem Tov explained, we're talking about the words of Torah and the words of tefillah, of prayer. If you want to be secure in this world that we're living, a world that is filled with all sorts of negativity and evil, and you want to be secure, the way to be secure is by entering into the words of Torah. What does it mean to enter into the words of Torah? It's not enough just to learn Torah, which even if that's the only thing you do is to learn Torah, it's a great thing, but it's not enough. You have to enter into it. You have to allow the words of Torah to envelop you, to surround you, to encompass you. Just like you enter into a home, you are encompassed by the home. It gives you security, it gives you privacy, it gives you integrity, because a person without a home, a homeless person, doesn't have the dignity that a human being deserves. So a home is what gives you privacy, dignity, and security. So enter into the Torah, put yourself totally into the Torah. And the same thing with prayer. It's not enough to mumble the words, to recite the words, to even sing the words. You have to put your heart and soul into the words of prayer. And that will protect you from all sorts of negative influences. That's how the Baal Shem Tov interpreted the words, Bo el hateva, go into the ark, go into the words of Torah and the words of prayer. So there are two kinds of people that might feel that they are an exception to the rule. The rule of entering into the words of Torah and prayer do not apply to them. There are people who look at this in a positive way. They look at their situation in a positive way. They say, look, I'm such a righteous person. They say, I am so devoted to doing the right thing. I'm studying Torah. Why do I have to go into the words of Torah? I'm beyond that. I'm not going to be harmed. I'm impervious to the threats from the outside. So the Torah tells us that we interpret the words in his generation, l'shvach, in a positive way, in a complimentary way, that it's a sign that he's such a great tzaddik, that if he'd be in another generation, he'd even be greater, which hints to us that even if you're such a great tzaddik, you're not invulnerable. You are still vulnerable, and you still need to enter into the words of Torah. That's why you would think the people who are known as great tzaddikim, very righteous and holy people, these are people who don't appear to have a Yetzer Hara, an evil inclination, why do they have to be so devoted to the study of Torah? Can't they take it easy? Why do they? These are precisely the people that study Torah day and night and can't imagine themselves separating themselves from the words of Torah. You would think the higher you are, the less you need the words of Torah. I already study the Torah. I already know the Torah. No, it's not enough. Even if you're l'shvach, even if you are to be praised, you still have to enter into the words of Torah and the words of tefillah, of prayer. But then there's the opposite argument from someone who's on a very low level, someone who feels that maybe relative to the evil people, he may not be considered evil, but because you're only relatively righteous, but you're not really righteous, you'll say to yourself, I can't be saved by entering into the words of Torah, by entering the ark, entering into the words of prayer, because I'm too far gone. I'm so lowly that I can't be helped. I can't be saved. And this is a tendency that many people have, that they knock themselves and they put themselves down. They denigrate themselves. And by doing that, they deny themselves opportunities to grow and to be elevated and to escape the morass, to escape the negativity of the world. So the Torah therefore says, whether you think you're holy, you still need to go into the ark. Or whether you think you're so unholy and so far from righteousness, you can be helped by going into the ark, by going into the words of Torah and tefillah and prayer. Now, the Torah tells us that Noach was a tzaddik tamim, as I said before, a righteous person, but perfect. Now, a little bit later, God speaks to Noach, and he tells him, go into the teva, into the ark, because I have seen that you are a tzaddik in this generation. It doesn't say the word tamim. Tzaddik, you're righteous, but doesn't have the word tamim, you're perfectly righteous. Why does it delete the word tamim when God speaks to Noach? So Rashi quotes the Midrash that says that from here we derive that when you praise a person to their face, you only say part of their praise. When you're talking about them not in their face, you say all their praise. The simple understanding of this is that if you are talking to a person directly and you want to praise them, don't go all the way. Don't say all their qualities, which is the opposite of the way many people behave. Many people will want to flatter you while they're talking to you directly. They'll say you're the greatest, you're this, you're that. But when they talk about you behind your back, and I'm not talking about people who speak lashon hara, who speak evil of others. We're talking about good people. But when they're talking about the person behind their back, they may not say all their praise. Why? Because when they're speaking to them directly, they want to flatter them, which is a negative. Judaism doesn't approve of flattery. If it's genuine praise, because you really feel how special they are, and you want them to know that they're appreciated, that's one thing. But if you're just trying to flatter them to gain their approval and to maybe they'll do you some favors, they'll reciprocate. So there's a tendency that you'll exaggerate their qualities. And even if it's not an exaggeration, you'll just say everything you know about them that's positive. But when you're talking about them behind their back, you don't feel compelled to do it. No, that's not the right thing. When you're in their presence, say everything about them. Behind their back, when you're not in their presence, when you're in their presence, say part of their praise. When you're not in their presence, you say all of their praise. But there's another way of understanding this, a deeper way of understanding this. And that is that when you are in the person's presence, which means when the person is alive, when the person is still here in this world, don't say all their praise. Why? Because they still have more to do. Don't insinuate that what they have done, is all that they can possibly do. Always leave room so that they should realize that as great as they are, they're still short of the mark. You know, in Hebrew, the word for sin, one of the words for sin is chet. Chet does not really mean sin. It means short of the mark. And that's why it says in the Talmud, there is no tzaddik There was no righteous person on earth that is righteous who doesn't ever sin. That's a biblical verse. And the Talmud uses that to describe even righteous people and holy people, that even they have the ability to sin. So the truth is, that's not what it means. It doesn't use the word that really means sin. In Hebrew, the word sin is avon, pesha, but the word chet, shelo yechta, means there's no righteous person who is not short of the mark. Even the greatest tzaddik, Moshe Rabbeinu, the patriarchs, the Baal Shem Tov, the Rebbe, all of these great people, they will be the first people to tell you, you know what? As much as we accomplished, I still am short of the mark. The Rebbe, in a very painful talk the Rebbe gave in 1991, was that all of what he accomplished was nothing because we didn't merit to see the coming of Mashiach. In other words, even if you do everything, there's no person in this generation and many generations before that accomplished as much as the Rebbe in every area of Jewish life. Whether it's Torah, the Rebbe was the most prolific teacher of Torah. Right now we have about 250 volumes of his teachings. In the realm of tzedakah, the Rebbe distributed millions of dollars at tzedakah, made each individual a shliach to give tzedakah by giving each person a dollar, and the Rebbe generated so much for tzedakah for all different causes. Tefillah, prayer, the Rebbe would go at least twice a week to the gravesite of his father-in-law and pray for the tens of thousands of people who would write to him and asking him for his blessing. He would pray for these people standing in the winter, the cold of the winter, the heat of the summer for 5, 6, 7 hours at a time. A man in his late 80s would conduct himself that way. So I can't imagine anyone being more perfect, and yet the Rebbe would be the first person to tell you, I failed, I did not accomplish what I could have accomplished. That's how everyone should feel, that as much as we accomplished, we only accomplished a limited amount. There's much more. So in the person's presence, when they're still here, never imply that they're perfect, because that means you're telling them they have no more reason to live. They fulfilled their mission. They're ready to leave this world. When the person is no longer here, so that's what he means, not in his presence. It means when they're no longer physically here, then you could say everything about them, because then you could appreciate the fact that they fulfilled their purpose in this world. There's a famous story in the Talmud, that what we just said before would shed light on that story. Rabbi Tarfon was one of the greatest sages. He was a colleague, first a teacher, then a colleague of Rabbi Akiva. And he was very, very ill, seriously ill, critically ill. And his mother came to the house of study to plead with the rabbis, his colleagues, to pray for him. And she would extol his virtue. She would say, this man treats me with such respect that once she was taking a walk in the outside in the yard, and the buckle of her sandals broke, so she couldn't wear her sandals. So he took his hands on the ground so she should walk on his hands until she entered the house, so she shouldn't get her feet soiled. And that was just one example of how much he did for me. And what do you think the rabbi said? Instead of saying, yes, your son is so great, he does such a great mitzvah of honoring his mother, they said he had done nothing compared to what he could do to honor his mother. And the commentators are puzzled by this. A mother is pleading with rabbis to pray for her son and extolling his virtue, and they're knocking him. They're saying that what he did is nothing compared to what he has to do. Why would they do that? Why would they be so disparaging? These were his colleagues who loved him and cared for him, and they certainly would pray for him. And the commentaries answer that when she was extolling the virtue of her son, she was implying that he's perfect. He has done so much, she can't imagine anyone doing more to honor a mother as much as he did. And the rabbi said, if what you're doing is you're telling us that he's perfect, if he's perfect, he no longer has to live and continue to accomplish things. There's so much more he has to do in this regard of honoring his mother, and therefore he has to recover and live a much longer life. So whenever you praise someone, always recognize that whatever good they have accomplished, always give them the impression that they still have to live longer and accomplish more. They should not be short of the mark. God tells Noah to build the ark. What are the dimensions of the ark? So the Torah tells us 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high, tall. A cubit, there are different opinions what it is. It's approximately 20 inches. There are opinions that say it's more than that. Some say a little bit less, but about 20 inches, a little more than a foot and a half. So a contemporary commentary says something interesting. He says if you take the numbers, the dimensions of the ark, you have 30. In Hebrew, 30 is a lamed. You have 300, that's the shin, and 50 is a nun. If you put those three letters together, lamed, shin, nun, it spells lashon, the tongue. And this commentary points out that the ark was there to purify the world from the sins associated with the tongue. Now, the Torah never mentions anything about the tongue. It just says that these people were corrupt with robbery. Our sages tell us with adultery, incest, sexual immorality. So where do you get the idea of the tongue? So he quotes a famous teaching of the Kabbalists talk about it a lot, that the corruption of speech is connected very directly with the corruption of one's sexuality. In other words, people whose language is corrupt their own morality as well. And goes both ways. If you're immoral, it'll manifest itself with foul language, with unclean, impure language, with slanderous language, all forms of bad language. The tongue is the most important and most powerful organ. The tongue could kill, and the tongue could save. So the people of that generation did not have control over their tongue, and that's why the purification from that sin involved the dimensions that give us the word lashon, the tongue. The teva, the ark, was built 3 stories. The bottom was for garbage, refuse. The middle was for the animals. The upper story was for the people. So one of the Chassidic commentators explains that there are 3 categories of people. There's one category, and then these are the 3 categories of people that have to enter into the ark. As we said before, in the name of the Baal Shem Tov, they have to enter into the words of Torah and the words of prayer. But there are 3 categories of people. There are people who are in the dumps, people whose life can best be described as waste. They're so evil. These are people who the Talmud would refer to as rishoim, wicked people. Now, wicked doesn't necessarily mean that they're violent. Wicked can mean a person who doesn't have the respect for God and transgresses. Then you have the second floor, the Beinoni. That's the place for the animals. That's the person who has an animal soul, but is able to control that animal, to tame that animal. Yes, they'll tame it, and the next day the animal will come back and behave as an animal, and you control it again. This is known as the Beinoni. The Alter Rebbe, the first Chabad Rebbe, in his classic work, the Tanya, he named the Tanya actually the Sefer Shel Beinonim, the book of the Beinoni, the intermediate. And he says that the Beinoni is the ideal. There's the higher level, the Tzaddik. The Tzaddik, you would think, is the ideal, and in a certain sense it is. But not everyone could be a tzaddik. The tzaddik is the one who is devoid of any sin, someone who doesn't sin at all, who has completely taken over his animal soul and transformed it into a positive energy. That tzaddik doesn't have to struggle with evil, doesn't have to struggle with an animal soul. But then there's the in-between person, the Beinoni. On one level, the Beinoni is the same as the Rasha, has the same struggles as the person who commits crimes, as the person who does evil. He has no less of a struggle than the Rasha, but he has to struggle. He doesn't wake up in the morning totally devoid of any inclination to sin. He still, every day, the day before he conquered his animal soul, he didn't allow it to control him. The next day he'll have to fight the same struggle. Of course, every now and then you win a battle here, you win a battle there, and you might have changed your personality to some degree, but ultimately the animal soul will come back, and sometimes come back with a vengeance, and you have to struggle with it. That's the second level. Then there's the third level, the one I alluded to before, the tzaddik, the human domicile, the place where there's only humanity. Now, many people, when they make mistakes, they'll say, I'm only human, but if you really know what the word human means, in Judaism, human means that you're completely in control of your animal soul, and the animal soul doesn't really bother you anymore. So the humans, the part of the ark that was for the humans, means the part of the ark that represents the level of the tzaddik, the righteous person. All three levels have an obligation to enter into the words of Torah and enter into the words of prayer. Because even the person who's in the dumps, the person who is associated with garbage, with refuse, the people who have lost every battle with their Yetzer Hara, with their evil inclination, they are not beyond being salvageable. They can still be salvaged. And even if they can't be salvaged, which is not true, but even if that would be true, they're still a Jew, and they have to do what Jews have to do. In other words, if a person would be told by God himself that no matter how much you're going to try, you're going to remain a lowlife. You're not going to grow spiritually in any way whatsoever. Well, if God says that, and then you can't fight that. That person has the same obligation to do a mitzvah as anyone else. When the Rabbi launched the Mitzvah Tefillin, the Tefillin campaign, to put on tefillin with a Jew, and many Jews were stopped in the street and were asked, are you Jewish, and would you like to put on tefillin? And many, over the years, hundreds of thousands of Jews put on tefillin. And there were critics who said, what's the point? These people are not going to become observant. They're not going to start keeping Shabbos. They're not going to start keeping kosher. They're not going to start praying 3 times a day and doing all the mitzvahs. So why put on tefillin with them one time? You may never see them again. And the Rebbe explained, based on Jewish law, that there's no such thing. Even if you never would want to do a mitzvah, and you have an opportunity to do a mitzvah once, you have an obligation to do it, and therefore we have an obligation to make it possible for that person to do that mitzvah. You do a mitzvah not because it's making you, putting you in a better class of human being. That may be true, and that's a good thing, but that's not why you do the mitzvah. You do the mitzvah because God says, I want you to do it. The fact that you're never going to do it again, although the Rebbe said that's not even true, because once you do a mitzvah, you become hooked. It's like a drug. It makes you more refined, and you'll most likely do another mitzvah, as the sages in Ethics of the Fathers say, mitzvah gereris mitzvah, one mitzvah drags another mitzvah. But even if that would not be the case, even if you know, because God himself sends Eliyahu Hanavi, Elijah the prophet, and says you're never going to do another mitzvah in your life, in fact you're going to keep on doing sins, you still have an obligation to do that one mitzvah. And therefore, even if you're in the bottom level, you still have to enter the words of Torah and the words of prayer. If you're in the middle level, that's where you get the strength to overcome the animal soul. But even if you're on the highest level, and you think, I already reached the top, as I said before, there's no such thing as reaching the top. The people who are closest to the top are the ones who recognize that they are so far away from the ideal, because as much as they grow, the ideal becomes more elusive, goes higher and higher, and they're constantly striving to reach that high point, and they never feel that they have achieved that goal. They're always yearning for more and more. The question that is asked, if these people are so righteous and so perfect, they don't have a challenge, it would seem. So what is the point of doing mitzvahs? They don't have any challenges. To them, doing a mitzvah is as easy as pie. It's not a challenge at all. And the same question could be asked when Mashiach comes. Eventually, the Yetzer Hara will disappear. What will be the purpose of life? There'll be no more challenges. And the answer is, challenges, we're so accustomed to challenges coming from an adversary. There's an adversary and we have to overcome it, and that's how we meet a challenge, and that's how we grow. But there are other kinds of challenges. There are challenges within goodness itself. You could stop at a certain level and you're perfect. Relative to everyone else, you're perfect. The challenge is to say, no, I'm not perfect. I can still go higher and higher, even though I'm higher than everyone else. In business, if a person reaches the point where they're the richest person in the world, they still feel a desire to make more money. I'm not sure that that's true about everyone, but there are many people who could be multi-billionaires, and they're still trying to make more money. But they're much wealthier than anyone else. The second person coming in second is $50 billion less. So you won the race, but you still want more. Where does that come from? It comes from the neshama that feels, as much as I have accomplished, as high as I have gone, I want more. I want to keep on growing and growing, and there's no limit. And you don't measure yourself by using relativity. Relative to someone else, I'm much better. Relative to God, you're still nothing. And you have to keep on climbing and growing. That's one kind of challenge, a vertical challenge. And then there's a horizontal challenge. Goodness manifests itself in many different ways. Goodness manifests itself through Torah, using the mind. Goodness, holiness manifests itself through the heart. Prayer is called the service of the heart, through acts of through love and kindness. Emotions. Then there's holiness, which manifests itself in action, just doing the right things, doing the mitzvahs, even without understanding, without feeling. So holiness manifests itself in three different ways, generally speaking, three ways. And when you're engaged in one and you're really into it, you're reluctant to go into the second one. So here's a Jew who's steeped in Torah, and then he said, stop learning now. Now is the time to pray, which doesn't involve the intellectual faculties. It involves the heart. And then you're told, stop praying. Now it's time to go out and do a mitzvah, a physical action. You tear yourself away from one area of goodness and you do another form of goodness and of holiness and of righteousness. That's how, even in the Messianic age, we will still have challenges in vertically in growing to higher levels, and challenges horizontally going from one area of holiness to another, and then coming back again, and keeping on changing our mode of relationship with God.